The garden party had gone quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they sense a man of consequence moving through their number with a purpose they have not yet understood. Cecily stood at the edge of the lawn, her hands still, the document case held against her side, and she watched the Earl of Ashmore cross 40 feet of gravel path in the direction of Mr. Aldous Crane. And she thought, with the peculiar calm that follows a very great shock, that she had never seen a man walk that way before. Not with anger. Not with haste. With the unhurried precision of someone who had already decided everything and was merely arriving at the conclusion in his body. She had not expected him to move at all. She had not expected, in truth, any of what had happened in the last quarter hour. She had not expected to open the document case in front of 40 members of the county's assembled gentry and name, in a clear and level voice, the precise date printed on Mr. Crane's survey, which was a date 3 months after her father's death, which was a date on which no living man could have commissioned her father's signature, which was a forgery. And she had said so because there was nothing else to say, and because the alternative was silence, and she had never been able to choose silence when a lie was standing in the room dressed as a fact. She had not expected the Earl to hear her. She had not expected him to turn. To understand how she came to be standing on that lawn with a leather document case and a pounding heart and 40 acres of disputed land still unresolved beneath her feet, one must go back to the morning in October when the last of her father's creditors had been satisfied, and the house in Wiltshire that had been the Hartwell family's for 60 years was no longer the Hartwell family's. And Cecily had stood in her father's study with Agnes at her shoulder, and looked at the cleared shelves and thought about which objects still belonged to them. The surveying case had been her father's. It was not an object of obvious value, being worn at the corners and faded along the spine, with a brass clasp that had not aligned properly since the summer of 1812. But it contained her father's working papers, his field notes, his correspondence with the county surveyor's office, and, at the very back, in a manila sleeve he had labeled in his careful hand, the original measured survey of the 40 acres that abutted the Crane property to the east. She had taken it because it belonged to her, because Agnes had asked her not to leave without something that was truly theirs, and because some instinct she could not have named told her the papers inside might one day be needed. £600. That was what remained of the Hartwell debt after the house was sold, a sum sufficient to prevent them from establishing themselves anywhere with any security, and insufficient to generate any return that would address it. Their father had been a capable man who had made a series of unwise decisions in the last 3 years of his life, none of them dishonest, all of them expensive. What he had left his daughters was a surname that still commanded a degree of respect in this county, 2 trunks of clothing that had been fashionable 5 years ago, Agnes's talent for the pianoforte, and lodged inside a worn leather case, 40 acres of unresolved land. Mr. Crane had been claiming that land for 7 years. He had always claimed it through letters and through lawyers, always at a distance, always just close enough to the legal threshold to prevent the Hartwells from dismissing him, and far enough from it to prevent them from pursuing him. When their father died, the claim sharpened. When the house was sold, it became a demand. And when the solicitor handling the estate informed Cecily that the Earl of Ashmore, as senior magistrate of the county, had offered to arbitrate the matter before it proceeded to Chancery, she had not felt relief. She had felt the particular caution of a woman who has learned that the offers of powerful men are rarely without cost. She arrived at Ashmore on a Wednesday morning in the first week of November, Agnes beside her in the hired carriage, the document case across her knees. The house was larger than she had prepared herself to receive. It sat at the end of a long elm avenue, pale stone against gray sky, and it had the quality of a house that has never needed to justify itself, because nothing in its long history had asked it to. A footman met them at the step and addressed her as Miss Hartwell, which was correct, and conducted them to a guest suite in the east wing, which was more comfortable than she had anticipated, and left them without explanation of when they would meet the Earl. They met him that evening, at a dinner that Lady Miriam Ashmore, the Dowager Countess, had arranged with the fluency of a woman for whom social architecture was not a skill, but an instinct. There were 12 at table. Cecily was placed between a retired general whose hearing had been compromised at Waterloo, and a young curate who spoke of nothing but the drainage improvements on the far side of the estate. She ate what was set before her, and spoke when spoken to, and watched, from beneath very level attention, the Earl of Ashmore at the head of his table. He was 34 or 35, she judged. His face had the quality she had only previously associated with county maps, precise and unrevealing, and organized around specific elevations that told you nothing about the terrain until you had been moving across it for some time. He did not speak much. When he did, the table attended to him with the prompt deference of people who understand that silence from a man of his position is not a social failing, but a form of authority. He glanced at her once, during a conversation about the local roads, and the glance lasted no longer than any other glance he distributed across the table, and told her nothing. Agnes, across from her, caught her eye and raised one small brow, and Cecily returned the smallest possible shake of her head, which Agnes understood to mean, "Not yet, and possibly not ever, and we must be patient." The following morning brought a letter from Mr. Crane, delivered to the house before 9 o'clock, requesting a private meeting with Cecily in the library before the formal arbitration hearing that had been scheduled for the following Friday. She read it twice, then read it to Agnes, then set it on the small writing table in their sitting room and looked at it. £200. That was what he offered her, in language sufficiently oblique to deny in court and sufficiently plain to understand without difficulty, in exchange for withdrawing the Hartwell claim to the 40 acres. He did not call it a bribe. He called it a settlement of personal hardship, which was a phrase that had the shape of generosity and the substance of purchase. She wrote back that afternoon and declined. Agnes asked her whether that was wise, and Cecily said that it depended on your definition of the word. And Agnes laughed, and then stopped laughing, and said she was frightened, and Cecily sat beside her on the narrow settee, and held her hand, and did not say that she was frightened too, because Agnes did not need that information, and it was not, in any event, a fear she was willing to act on. The first occasion on which the word schemer reached her ears occurred 3 days after her arrival in the drawing-room, in an aside from Lady Miriam to Mrs. Dorothea Fenn, who was not yet a daughter-in-law, but appeared to be moving in that direction with the confidence of someone who has been told the destination is secured. Cecily had entered the room quietly and had not been immediately noticed, and she had heard Lady Miriam say to Mrs. Fenn that the Hartwell girl had the look of a schemer about her, one of those provincial daughters who arrive at a great house with a grievance and depart with a great deal more than they arrived with. Mrs. Fenn had agreed with the precision of a woman whose agreement was always calibrated to be useful, rather than felt. Cecily had crossed the room and taken a chair near the window, and opened her book. And Lady Miriam had looked at her with the mild, pleasant expression of a woman who has said exactly what she intended to say, and is not troubled by witnesses. She gave the word no more attention than it deserved on its face. She gave it rather more attention in private, lying awake while Agnes slept and the fire settled, because the word had the quality of a label, and she had learned that labels applied publicly tend to adhere regardless of their accuracy, and she did not yet know how to counter it. It was on the 4th morning that she saw the letter. She had risen early, as was her habit, and gone down to the library before the household had woken, intending to consult one of the county survey volumes she had located on the south shelves 2 days prior. The library at Ashmore was a room that expected to be taken seriously. It had a fire already laid by a housemaid who had come and gone before Cecily arrived, and it had the smell of paper and good oil and the faint additional scent of something that had been smoked there within the last day. She found the volume she wanted and settled at the reading table, and did not hear the footstep in the corridor for several minutes. A young housemaid entered, carrying a folded letter and a somewhat distressed expression. She had clearly expected the room to be empty. The letter, she explained, had been delivered to the east wing by mistake, addressed to one of the house guests in the north corridor, a Mr. Parslow from the County Road Commission. It was, she said, clearly marked with his name. She had brought it down, intending to leave it on the hall table for the butler to correct. Cecily looked at the letter. It was sealed. It bore Mr. Parslow's name in a clerk's hand. It also, she noted, bore the wax impression of the county surveyor's office. She held the letter for approximately 4 seconds. Then she gave it back to the housemaid and said that it should go to Mr. Parslow directly, that the butler should be informed of the misdirection, and that she would mention it to the housekeeper herself if the girl preferred to avoid any difficulty about having entered a room she had not expected to contain a guest. The housemaid thanked her and departed quickly, and Cecily returned to her volume and did not think about what a letter from the county surveyor's office to a member of the road commission might have contained, because it was not her letter, and it was none of her concern. She did not know then that the Earl of Ashmore had been standing in the corridor for the preceding 40 seconds, having come from his study and paused at the half-open library door, and had observed every word and every movement of that exchange. She did not know what his face looked like during those 40 seconds, because she could not see him. The audience could. He had gone very still in the way that a man goes still when he is revising a conclusion he believed settled. There was a dinner 2 evenings later, at which Dorothea Fenn, who was, Cecily now understood, the daughter of a baronet with whom Lady Miriam had maintained a long and mutually advantageous friendship, was seated at the Earl's right hand, and Cecily was seated at the far end of the table between the retired general and a young cousin of the house who had recently come down from Oxford and wanted very much to discuss German philosophy. She listened to the cousin with genuine attention and spoke carefully, and felt, once, the sensation of being observed, and looked up and found the Earl's gaze already moved away toward the window, which told her nothing except that she had imagined it. And she was not a woman given to imagination as a general practice. Lady Miriam, at the second drawing-room gathering of the week, with Dorothea arranged at her side like a particularly well-dressed argument, said to the 3 ladies nearest her that she had encountered schemes of this nature before, a woman with a grievance and a document case, and very little else arriving at a house of consequence, and conducting herself as though she had some claim beyond the purely legal. The label was spoken with a smile that managed to remain technically within the bounds of politeness, while ensuring that every woman in hearing range understood precisely what was being communicated. Dorothea touched the ribbon of her evening gown and said nothing, which was its own form of agreement. Cecily, who was near enough to hear and far enough to be deniably outside the circle, set down her teacup and considered. The word schemer had now been deployed twice in semi-public settings, once in the drawing-room and once in this same gathering, with the same audience within reach, and it had acquired the particular adhesion of a phrase that has been said aloud more than once by a woman whose social position gives her words a weight that accuracy cannot automatically override. She did not respond to it. She did not defend herself in the drawing-room, because a defense, offered in that setting, would have confirmed the portrait more effectively than silence. She understood this because her father had been a solicitor, and she had grown up hearing him explain, with patient precision, the difference between what a thing was and what a thing could be made to appear to be. The Earl of Ashmore's wound she did not learn in the drawing room or at dinner. She learned it obliquely on the morning before the formal hearing, when she passed the library door and heard him speaking to his land agent, a steady-voiced man named Calworth, about a tenancy matter that had been resolved at the Earl's instruction 3 years prior and had not been resolved well. A man named Trent, a farmer on the eastern edge of the estate, had been the subject of a dispute between two larger claimants, and the Earl had arbitrated in favor of the claimant with the stronger legal case, and Trent had lost his lease, and the stronger legal case had not, in the end, protected Trent from the outcome that the legal logic had produced. He had left the county. The Earl said to Calworth, in a tone that was not loud and did not require to be, that he was aware the Calworth's accounts showed no further Trent tenancy, and that he would like to know what Calworth understood to have become of the man and his family, because he had been thinking about it. Cecily walked on. She did not pause. She did not allow herself to stand in the corridor absorbing what she had heard, because that would have been a form of intrusion she was not willing to commit. But she carried what she had heard with her to her sitting room, where Agnes was mending a cuff at the window, and she sat in the chair by the fire and was quiet for a moment, and Agnes, who knew her, did not ask. She understood, with the precision that had always been her most reliable faculty, that the coldness she had read as indifference was not indifference at all. It was caution, the caution of a man who has used his authority once and watched it produce exactly the wrong result, and who had not since trusted his own judgment with anything that could not be verified by evidence. The formal hearing was held on a Friday morning in the estate's document room, a long paneled space off the entrance hall that smelled of old paper and brass fittings and the particular formality of a room that has been used for serious purposes across many years. The Earl sat at the head of the table. Mr. Crane sat to his left, with his solicitor, a man named Grieve, who wore a very good coat and an expression of practiced confidence. Cecily sat to the Earl's right, with Agnes behind her. Calworth was present as a state witness. A justice of the peace named Bamford sat along the wall as official observer. Mr. Crane presented his case with the help of Grieve, who laid out the documentation in a sequence designed to appear inevitable. The survey he presented was clear and professionally executed, showing the 40-acre strip as belonging to the Crane property by virtue of the original Crane-Hartwell boundary agreement. The survey bore her father's name and a date in March of 1814. Her father had died in December of 1813. Cecily opened the document case. She removed the manila sleeve. She took out the original survey, which bore the county surveyor's stamp and her father's signature, and a date in September of 1812, which placed the boundary exactly where the Hartwells had always understood it to be. She laid it on the table and said, in a voice that was quite steady, that she would like to draw the Earl's attention to the date on Mr. Crane's document, which was the 14th of March, 1814, and then to the date of her father's death, which was the 9th of December, 1813, and to the fact that her father could not have commissioned or signed a survey in March of a year in which he had been dead for 3 months, and that she believed the document Mr. Crane had presented was not authentic. The room was very still. Mr. Grieve said that the accusation was serious and unsubstantiated. Cecily said that she had her father's original survey, with the county surveyor's stamp, and that the date spoke for itself. Mr. Crane looked at her with the expression of a man who has underestimated the depth of a body of water and found himself some distance from the bottom, and for the 3rd time since her arrival, she heard the word schemer, this time from his own mouth, directed not at the room but at her, with a sharpness that had shed all its previous politeness. The Earl of Ashmore said nothing. He picked up Mr. Crane's document, held it for a moment, set it down, and picked up Cecily's original. He read it with a care that had nothing performative about it. Then he looked at Bamford, and Bamford looked at the table. Then he rose from his chair. He walked out of the document room. He walked through the entrance hall. He walked out onto the terrace and then across the gravel path, and then onto the lawn where the garden party had begun, because the garden party had been scheduled 2 weeks ago and could not simply be unmade, and 40 members of the county gentry were drinking mulled cider and discussing the road improvements and the upcoming assembly at Marlborough, and none of them had yet understood that the document room had produced a resolution. If you have stayed with this story through its careful accumulation, through the drawing room and the corridor and the formal table, you may find yourself wanting to leave a word in the comments about the moment you stopped doubting what the Earl intended. The story has been waiting for this crossing. He crossed the lawn. He crossed it with the unhurried precision that Cecily had noted from her position at the lawn's edge. And it was unhurried because he had already decided, and it was precise because he knew exactly where he was going, which was toward Mr. Crane, who had followed him out from the document room with Mr. Grieve at his elbow and the bluster of a man who has not yet accepted the shape of a verdict. Lady Miriam had positioned herself near the mulled cider with Dorothea beside her, and she watched her son cross the lawn with an expression that shifted, in a very small way, from social fluency to something closer to attention. She had understood the social architecture of Ashmore for 31 years. She understood, watching him move, that the architecture was about to change, and that understanding arrived in her chest as a single contracted silence. Dorothea's hand went still on her glass. She had been told by Lady Miriam and by her mother, and by the accumulated logic of the last 2 seasons, that the position was essentially arranged, and she was not a woman who had been given many reasons to doubt what she was told by people whose authority she respected. She watched the Earl cross the lawn, and she understood, watching him, that the logic had been applied to a situation it did not fit, and that understanding was quick and clean and not cruel, only accurate. The Earl stopped in front of Mr. Crane and addressed him in a voice sufficiently audible to reach the nearest cluster of guests, and sufficiently measured to preclude any possibility of interpretation as heat. He said that the document Mr. Crane had presented to the arbitration proceeding bore a date that postdated the signatory's death by 3 months, that this discrepancy made the document inauthentic, and that he was, in his capacity as senior magistrate of the county, directing Mr. Crane to withdraw his claim to the 40 acres in question, and to address the question of the document's provenance with a solicitor of his own, since the matter would not proceed through the Ashmore arbitration on the basis of evidence that could not be verified. He said it once. He did not repeat it. Mr. Crane opened his mouth. The Earl said quietly that there was nothing further to discuss on the subject. Mr. Grieve touched his client's sleeve and said something into his ear, and Mr. Crane closed his mouth, and the particular quality of his silence told everyone close enough to observe it, that Grieve had explained, in the compressed economy of a professional assessment, that the field had closed. The crowd had turned in the way that crowds turn when they have understood that something of significance has occurred, and the understanding has arrived all at once, and no one wishes to be the last person in the room to receive it. Bamford had followed from the document room and now stood at the edge of the gathering with the deliberate stillness of a man who is making a mental note of what he is witnessing. Lady Miriam's fan, which had been held at the measured height appropriate to garden party composure, descended a precise inch. The Earl turned from Crane and walked back across the lawn. He stopped in front of Cecily. She was still holding the document case. She had not moved from the edge of the lawn because she had not been certain what was happening and had not wished to appear to assume. He said, "Miss Hartwell?" It was the first time he had addressed her by name in a public setting, and the name, in his mouth, in front of 40 people who had spent the preceding fortnight absorbing Lady Miriam's careful label, had the quality of a correction. Not a loud correction. A precise one, of the kind that does not need to be made twice. He said, "Your father's survey is the instrument of record. The 40 acres are not in dispute." She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment in the way that a man looks at something he has been considering from a careful distance and has now moved close enough to assess without the distance's distortion. Then he said, low enough that it was only for her, "I should have looked at the document case sooner. The error was mine to make, and yours to correct. I am sorry for the delay." She had not expected that, either. She had expected the verdict. She had not expected the apology, and she was not certain what to do with it, except to receive it honestly, which she did, and to say that the delay had not been without its uses. And he had looked at her then, and she had seen in his face, for the first time clearly, what she had been misreading as indifference for the preceding 2 weeks, which was the face of a man who has learned to be careful, because carelessness cost someone who trusted him, and who has found, in the course of a fortnight, that he is no longer certain the caution is serving its original purpose. Agnes appeared at her side, quietly, as Agnes had a habit of doing at important moments, with the document case's strap held carefully in one hand, as though she understood that her sister's hands might need to be free. The county, rearranging itself around its new understanding, did so with the practiced smoothness of a social body that has considerable experience absorbing the Earl of Ashmore's decisions. Bamford spoke to 2 other justices who had been present at the party without official capacity. Calworth produced, from somewhere about his person, a copy of the estate records confirming the boundary as the Hartwell survey had always described it. Mr. Crane and Mr. Grieve departed through the garden gate with a speed that was not quite flight, but was not quite composed, and the gate closed behind them, and the lawn absorbed their absence without difficulty. Lady Miriam did not cross the lawn. She remained beside the mulled cider, and she did not speak for several minutes. And when she did speak, she spoke to the retired general about the condition of the Elm Avenue, which was the most neutral subject available to her. And Cecily, watching from her distance, understood that the dowager was not a woman who had intended cruelty. She was a woman who had organized her understanding of this situation around a set of categories that had proven insufficient, and the insufficiency was not comfortable to recognize, but she was recognizing it. And that recognition was its own form of correction, and it was, in its way, enough. Dorothea spoke to the young curate. She was composed. She was always composed. She was the kind of woman who had been trained to maintain composure precisely because she was the kind of woman for whom composure was occasionally the only thing standing between her and a humiliation she had not invited. She would be perfectly well. She would be engaged by the following season to someone whose situation was equally good and whose choice of her was unambiguous, and she would manage that future with the same competent attention she brought to everything. And none of this was her fault. And the story knew that. What followed was not immediate and was not simple, in the way that real resolutions rarely are. The £600 of Hartwell debt required a negotiation with the estate's legal adviser that occupied 3 additional meetings and 1 letter from a London solicitor, and its resolution came partly from the formal recognition of the 40-acre value and partly from a discussion between the Earl and Cecily in the library on a Wednesday afternoon that was, on the surface, entirely about legal instruments, and was, beneath the surface, the conversation they had been conducting across the entire fortnight without either of them quite acknowledging they were conducting it. She said, at one point in that Wednesday conversation, that she had been trying to determine whether his caution about the Trent matter had made him more thorough or less, and whether thoroughness and caution were the same quality in different clothes. He had been quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was not preparing a response, but assessing a question. Then he said that in his experience they were distinct, that caution was self-protective, and thoroughness was something else, and that he had perhaps been confusing the two for some years. He said this without apparent discomfort, which told her more about him than most people would have disclosed in a direct declaration. She said she thought that was probably true, and that she was familiar with the same confusion. He looked at her across the table with the look she had seen on the lawn, which was the look of a man who has moved close enough to assess without distortion. And he said, after a moment, that he would like her to remain at Ashmore. She had understood him correctly, and said so. And the formality of what followed was a formality she found she did not mind, because it had the quality of something arrived at by evidence, rather than by custom. And evidence was a language she had trusted all her life. The library at Ashmore in January was a different room than it had been in November. The fire was larger, because the cold had increased, and the window that faced the north garden was silvered along its panes, with a frost that had been building since the previous week. And outside it, the first snow of the year was coming down in the measured, unhurried way of snow that intends to stay. Agnes was in the music room at the end of the corridor, which was now her music room, with the small upright pianoforte the Earl had arranged to have brought up from the lower house when he understood that Agnes played well enough that silence was a deprivation rather than a neutral state. The sound of the instrument came down the corridor in a thread, a passage from a Clementi sonata that Agnes had been working on for 3 weeks and had now, by the evidence of the evenings, resolved. The debt of £600 had been addressed by the legal recognition of the 40-acre value and a repayment structure that Cecily had worked out herself and presented to the Earl's legal adviser with the precision her father had taught her, and the adviser had looked at her over his spectacles for a moment and then agreed that her figures were correct, which she had already known. The remaining sum was manageable. It would be managed. It was no longer the object around which all planning was organized. Cecily sat in the chair by the library fire with the survey volume open across her lap, not reading it, listening to the snow outside and to Agnes's Clementi, and to the fire doing what fires do in January rooms when the winter is serious and the house is warm. The document case was on the lower shelf, beside her father's surveying texts, where she had put it after the formal resolution. It was not hidden. It was not prominent. It was exactly where a working document case should be, which was within reach, and not under constant observation. The Earl of Ashmore came in from the corridor, which he did most evenings at this hour, and took the chair across from hers. He did not speak immediately. He had never, in her experience, spoken before he had something to say, and she had come to understand this not as coldness, but as a form of respect that she found she shared. Agnes's music came down the corridor. The Clementi resolved at last into the quiet major chord that had been its destination for 3 weeks, and then began again from the beginning, because Agnes was Agnes, and a resolved passage was an invitation to understand why it had worked. He said, "She will want a better instrument." Cecily said, "She will want everything, and be careful about asking for any of it." He said, "She should not have to be." She looked at him across the fire in the January library, and the snow was coming down beyond the north window, and the document case was on its shelf, and the 40 acres were no longer in dispute, and the name she carried now was not the name of a grievance or a problem or a schemer. And Agnes was playing Clementi in the next room with the particular ease of someone who has stopped being frightened, and the fire was warm, and the house was theirs. She was home. If Cecily's long and careful walk from the edge of someone else's lawn to the center of a room that was finally her own moved something in you, leave a word in the comments about the moment you knew the Earl had already decided. This story was glad to tell itself to you.